Hello, so welcome to Translating Israel, which is the first public event of the Frankel Institute, which is focused this year on the theme of translating Jewish cultures. I'm Adriana Jacobs, Associate Professor of Modern Hebrew Literature at the University of Oxford and co-head fellow of this year's Frankel Institute. And today I'll be in conversation with the prize-winning Hebrew to English translator, Jessica Cohen. And following our conversation, there'll be a public Q&A, which will be moderated by Maya Barzilai, who is Associate Professor of Hebrew Literature and Jewish Culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and also co-head fellow of this year's institute. Questions for the Q&A can be submitted during the talk through the Q&A function in Zoom. And before we begin, I want to say a few words of introduction. So Jessica Cohen's translations have made it possible for readers of English to enjoy works by Israeli authors like David Grossman, Ronit Matalon, Etgar Keret, and many others. And in fact, looking at the list of books she's published, it reads like a who's who of Israeli literature. In addition to Grossman, Matalon, and Keret, we also find there Amos Oz, Yael Hedaya, and Maya Arad. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention her contributions to the short story genre. Her translations of stories by writers like Sayed Kashua and Agur Shif circulate in print and online, thereby creating additional opportunities for readers to encounter Israel's diverse and dynamic contemporary literary scene. So Jessica was born in Southeast England and at a young age moved with her family to Israel, where they eventually settled in Jerusalem. And she is credited growing up in a bilingual home as a major influence on her career as a translator. Since 1997, she's called the United States home, and living in Indiana, Washington State, New York, and now Colorado has made her attentive to the varieties of English that exist and the cultural differences between them. After years of working as a commercial translator, she's been focusing exclusively since 2012 on literary translation, and she's been a tireless advocate for the profession, including working with the Authors Guild to create a model contract for literary translators. Her work has been long admired by readers of Hebrew fiction and translation, and especially by those of us who teach Hebrew literature and translation. But in recent years, recognition of her work has expanded in a more global sense. Her translations have been recognized for awards by PEN International, the Sammy Rohr Foundation, the National Book Critics Circle, and many other organizations. And in 2017, she shared the prestigious Man Booker International Prize with David Grossman for her translation of his novel, A Horse Walks into a Bar. And more recently, she's been the recipient of the 2020 National Endowment for the Arts Translation Grant, which will support her translation of Leah Aini's Rose of Lebanon. Jessica has described translation as a process where, in her words, okay, I think we have a little moment where the recording stopped and it's picked up again. Okay. So as I was saying, translation is a creative act for Jessica that opens up a space where cultures can encounter each other. And it may not solve all our conflicts, but therein lies an opportunity which we need maybe now more than ever to learn from each other. And with that, I want to welcome Jessica Cohen to our virtual Frankel Institute. And I'm going to open up with the first question. So Jessica, we invited people who registered for the event to submit questions. So I want to start from a question from Daniel Drori. And the question is translation a political act? And I want to start here, especially in light of your 2017 Man Booker International Acceptance speech, where you said, and I quote, "To me, the Man Booker Prize is about recognizing works that break down walls and barriers, the fight against dehumanizing other people or other peoples, and finding the language to express the human experiences we all share." So drawing from your now almost 20 years of translating Hebrew Israeli fiction, how do you see that actually happening in literature? And how does translated literature advance, but maybe even complicate that vision with respect to Israel?
Well, first of all, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thank you so much to the Frankel Institute for inviting me, and to Adriana and Maya and Kelsey for making this all happen. I'll try and answer your question. First of all, I looked back at those words that I said at the Booker, and you know, it was only 3 years ago, but it was 3 years ago, which now seems like kind of another universe. And there seems now like something naive about even saying that, you know, and it's, as bad as things get in Israel, it turns out almost weekly that things could get even worse. So, you know, it's a little bit difficult for me to stand behind those words now, that hope that I have that literature can somehow, you know, act as a space for people to understand each other, because it does seem a little naive. But even so, I do hope that there is some way in which literature in general, and translated literature more specifically, can give readers a little bit of an opening to see how other people live. I mean, it's actually something that David Grossman has talked about a lot in the last few years, about this idea of us all, you know, every individual having kind of a whole world of possibilities, of other ways in which he or she could have been living. Other lives, other professions, other marriages, other genders, other ethnicities, whatever it is, you know, we all have this set of circumstances and identities that we have, but things could have been different. And he has talked about his writing as a way to try and imagine how his life could have been different and what other kind of latent possibilities might be inside him. And that's something that I relate to, I think, and that I experience when I read a good piece of writing, which is this little glimpse into, like, oh, my life could have been more like this life or more like that life. But in terms of the politics, you know, I think that I kind of think there are two separate questions there. So there is the question of the politics of what gets translated, and more specifically, what does not get translated. And that's a huge issue. And it's so tied up with, you know, economics, with kind of the system that we in the West live in, where things that sell are what we value, right? So publishers, and even small indie publishers, you know, they do need to make a living. So there's necessarily going to be a certain amount of restriction on what gets translated and what gets published. And, you know, it's not necessarily that the only things that will get published are extremely commercial and are perceived to, you know, going to be bestsellers. Obviously, that's not the case. But I think that there is, whether it's correct or not, publishers have a perception of what readers want. And when you're talking specifically about Israeli literature, I think there's assumed to be kind of a built-in niche audience, which is Jewish American or British readers, or readers who have a particular interest in Israel or in the Middle East, or what we like to kind of refer to as readers of world literature, which is a little bit of a meaningless term, but we all use it nonetheless. And for many of those readers, I think there's a certain perception of what Israel is. And I have found, and I've heard this from agents who try to sell Hebrew literature, that it's really hard to introduce works that don't fit in to those, you know, preconceived ideas of what Israelis are and what Israelis write about. And it's a little bit of a trap, because on the one hand, responses are, you know, that something is too specifically Israeli and therefore will not speak to a non-Israeli audience. On the other hand, I've had responses to projects that I've submitted that said, well, it's not Israeli enough. There's nothing uniquely Israeli about this, and so why would people want to read it when we could read, you know, the American version of this, or, you know, something that was written originally in English. And there's a whole other complicated set of, you know, the politics of publishing, really. It's not so much of translation, because anyone can sit down and translate something. The question is what's going to get published. But then the second part of, you know, this idea of politics and translation is, I think, very acutely felt by people who translate from, let's say, countries or parts of the world where politics are big and are everyday. So, you know, the basic fact is that I, as a Jewish Israeli citizen, there's really nothing I do that isn't political in some way. Because that is the nature of Israel. That's what the Israeli state has become. And I'm very aware of that. just, in my private life even, but certainly in my professional life as a translator, there is significance to what I choose to translate, and how I translate it, and who ends up reading it. And that's kind of inescapable, whether it's books that do or do not address the occupation, or whether it's issues of Ashkenazis versus Sephardics, or women's writing. All of those things, which often are political questions, are, I think, even more so when they're coming from Israel, which is such kind of a fraught society always.
Yeah, I think your answer sort of anticipated a question I wanted to ask you about sort of the role that publishers play in shaping perceptions of Israeli literature and how it's marketed. And you mentioned sort of that you've worked with both big mainstream publishers like Knopf, but also you've published with more independent publishers like New Vessel. And I'm curious if you've noticed that there are also opportunities maybe to push the envelope with certain publishers, for example, I'm assuming with smaller presses, but maybe not, or does every publisher represent their own kind of microculture and its own different perceptions of what kind of Israeli literature they want to deliver to the public, or does it present opportunities for actually maybe offering something that doesn't continue to feed into this idea, for example, that Israeli literature is all political or it has to be about certain things?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I should say that I've actually worked a lot more with large publishing houses than with small presses, just because of the type of projects I've usually done. When I have had kind of, quote unquote, smaller projects, things that don't, by writers who are not very well known, and I've tried to shop them around, I haven't been very successful. And those are times when I have approached small indie presses, and it's been really difficult. But, I haven't really sensed that there's a big difference in terms of what you're asking about between big houses and small presses. To me, it seems more about the individual editor who I happen to be working with. And with almost no exceptions, I've had really good editors who, I think a lot of translators have talked about, this kind of editorial culture, particularly in America, where everyone wants to kind of smooth things out and dumb things down a little. I have not personally encountered that. I mean, yes, sometimes there are particular cases in a particular book where an editor will try to make something a bit more, less ambiguous than it is in the original. Mm-hmm. And we've had discussions about that, but I really can't think of a case where it's become like a real confrontation where I feel like, no, they're trying to, destroy the essence of the book or anything like that. I think also, even with a big house that might have a big budget for promotion and that kind of thing and may have paid a big advance, for the most part, everyone knows that literary fiction in translation is not going to become a bestseller, with few happy exceptions, which are pretty much always surprises. So, but I think we all know that the way publishing works is, in each catalog, they may have the one or two, or if it's a big press, a handful of books that they decide, this is going to be our hit, and they will make it a hit. They will put the money in, and they can't guarantee it, but they can pretty much assure that it will do well. And it's rare that a translated book is one of those books. So it actually gives a little bit more freedom, I think, to not have to worry about that. The book is what it is, and this is what's going to be in English. And the editors that I've worked with have been pretty open, but I mean, if they've taken on the book, then they're going to let it be the book that it was in the original language. There are cases when books that I've translated have just simply been too long. I mean, many of them, in my opinion, were too long to begin with. And then what happens is when you go from Hebrew to English, there's a pretty significant expansion rate. And so, if you're going to try and come into the American market with a book by an unknown writer that's 700 pages long, it's just, the odds are stacked against you to begin with. So there have been cases where the author and the editor and I have agreed to cut things out. Yeah. But yeah, I don't feel like, what feeds into those preconceptions of what Israeli literature is or isn't is the decision about whether or not to buy the book to begin with, whether or not to publish it. Once it's at the editing stage, I haven't encountered any issues about that.
So let me ask you a little bit about cultural translation, which you touched on a bit in the previous answer. And what I mean here is not just translation as a cultural act, but actually translating or trying to translate cultural practices or text into a culture unfamiliar with them. And I'm thinking of the last Ronit Matalon book that you translated. It's in English, the title is "And the Bride Closed the Door." And in this book, a bride locks herself into a bathroom. Actually, I have my copy here. And she refuses to come out. She slips a note to her groom, and it's a Leah Goldberg poem that she's altered in a significant way. And so Leah Goldberg is one of the major kind of Hebrew poets of the 20th century. And it struck me that readers outside of Israel most likely don't know who she is, although some of her work has been translated into English. She's not as well known as, say, Daria Rabikovich or Yehuda Michai in translation. But there are also Israeli characters in the novel who appear to have no idea who she is. So this seems to complicate, I think, what we mean when we say that something is untranslatable. And I'm curious how in your work you deal with those moments where you have to sort of attend to a sort of degree of untranslatability that's expressed within the work, but that it is also going to maybe affect the reader of the translation.
Yeah, so it's an interesting case with Leah Goldberg. First of all, I should say that I'm not sure I really believe that there's anything that's untranslatable, but I do think there are things that don't need to be translated or should not be. I don't think that everything should be kind of forced over to the other side, whatever that side is. Leah Goldberg is, and it was interesting for me to hear you say that, she's not as well known as, say, Dalia Rabikovich, right? Which is true, but at the same time, in Israel, she's like one of the, foremothers of Israeli poetry, right? She's a classic. So people in Israel who do know her and know her work are either, literary people or those who haven't been out of high school for very long and remember studying her, I would say. So she is a well-known classic poet, but it's the kind of thing that you learn in high school and then you move on with your life, right? Most people are not keeping those things in their mind. And you can see that, as you mentioned in the book, where the bride's mother and the groom's parents, and pretty much everyone else in the story has no idea who she is. And in fact, they get her name wrong. These characters are, very much kind of working class, Mizrahi people. And for them, this is just another Ashkenazi name. They say, Leah who? Goldberger? Who is it? So it's interesting in terms of translation because the usual situation is that I'm trying to take a concept or a name that's very familiar in Israel to, Hebrew speakers and move it into a culture where it's not familiar. But here it's like it's almost the opposite of that. Like, how do I indicate in the translation that this name is actually not familiar to most of the characters in the book, and yet somehow, quote unquote, should be familiar. And then the poem itself, obviously it's kind of like with satire, right? If you haven't seen the original that something is parodying, that something is satirizing, then you don't get it. Here, the main character, the bride, writes her own version of this Leah Goldberg poem, in which the main thing that she does is change the gender of the kind of protagonist of the poem, the person who the poem is being addressed to. She changes it from male to female. Now Goldberg herself, in writing this poem, it's borrowed from a New Testament parable in which the characters are all male, but she has in her poem kind of rewritten a version on that in which the main kind of presence in the poem, I would say, is female, is the mother of the prodigal son in the poem. So there's this, like, all these multiple layers of borrowing that you know, if you don't have that poem in your mind, even as kind of a familiar sound, it's very difficult to get across. But you know, what I try to do in cases like this is kind of sneak in little hints or references to what the original is and what it might mean. And there's a scene in this book, or I guess the flashback, where the groom remembers this really bad argument that they had just before, you know, she shuts herself up in her room and refuses to come out for the wedding. And the argument was instigated by them watching a documentary film about Leah Goldberg, which the bride found really upsetting. And it's very clear that she has this very intense relationship with the character of Goldberg and somehow sees herself in this very tragic life that Goldberg had. So there are little hints that hopefully are enough to carry over the significance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because it's like, it feels with a lot of times with translation, some of these things I think readers can sort of, if they're interested to figure out sort of what's going on, they can do that kind of work of close reading. But most of the books you publish are with publishers who aren't going to ask you to include footnotes where you unpack all this information for the reader. But that also leads me to the question of how you handle multilingual writing, because also, you know, Israel is a country with many languages, and a lot of the books you've translated and stories you've translated contain these sort of meaningful, but also sometimes really politically charged multilingual moments. And in fact, Matalon, who uses Arabic in this novel, has described her use of Arabic, and here I'm actually quoting from your translation of one of her essays. She describes it as neither isolated nor innocent. And so I'm wondering what are your strategies for dealing with multilingualism that is neither isolated nor innocent, especially in the absence of footnotes or endnotes? So to what extent does the expected readership determine how much is explained in the translation and how much is left for readers to go to Google Translate to parse for themselves?
Yeah, so this is one of those things. I mean, I'm pretty sure, I don't know, I can't give 100% guarantee, but I'm going to estimate that not a single book that I've translated has not had a foreign word or many, many, many in it, whether it's Arabic, English, Yiddish, Ladino, any number of other languages. So it is a very frequent problem that we have to deal with when translated from Hebrew, especially contemporary literature. And I think in some cases it is what Ronit might have called innocent use, in that when it's a book that uses colloquial, you know, street language, say, there is a lot of Arabic in it that doesn't necessarily have any political significance, because Israelis use, you know, Hebrew-speaking Israelis use a lot of Arabic words. Most of them are curse words, but not necessarily. There's just a lot of slang where we've borrowed and in some cases corrupted Hebrew words, in addition to, you know, Turkish, Yiddish, whatever else. And so, of course, you could analyze, like, well, why is that and what are the deeper layers of that? But often a character is saying something idiomatic and it happens to use an Arabic word. Now, when I'm translating that, you know, it really depends. This is one of those things where I can't really say that I have a rule or even a principle to go by. It's very much a case-by-case basis. So it depends on how significant that word or phrase might be in the context. If I use something that most readers don't understand or don't know, how much is that really going to trip them up? How badly will that interfere in their understanding of the text? And if it's something that I think is just going to create an unnecessary obstacle, then I won't usually insist on leaving it in Arabic or even trying to find a way to distinguish it from the rest of the sentence. I'll just translate the whole thing into English. But sometimes I do leave a word in Arabic or whatever the original language is. And I will research to try and make sure I understand. Like, I've studied some Arabic, but my Arabic is by no means good. It's possible. And, you know, often we use a word in Hebrew that we think we know what it means, but it turns out when you research it, that has a very different meaning in the original. So I do think it's important for me to know that history and those layers. But but what ends up in the translation is whatever seems, and this is kind of an amorphous thing to try and describe, but if it's in dialogue in particular, it just has to sound like something that character would say, or that the English speaking, you know, doppelganger of that character would say. Once in a while, I've ended up using a Spanish word in English, just because I think there's some cultural equivalence to the way Americans use Spanish versus the way Israelis use Arabic in some cases. Obviously, the political undertones are not the same at all, but just linguistically, there's some parallel there. Yeah, but footnotes for me are never an option. Although I will say that when I've had a few opportunities to meet with other translators working on the same text into all of our respective languages, and I remember one meeting where, you know, we were all kind of just like, you know, tearing our hair out over this expression that we had to translate that was in, I think it was in fact Arabic. And the French translator said, well, I just put a footnote in. And everyone else was like, oh, no, you can't do that. But it turns out that for French readers, this is completely acceptable and in fact expected. And many works of fiction have footnotes in them to explain foreign terms. And that, you know, in English, it's just really not considered acceptable. So you kind of have to find a way around it.
Well, it's interesting because sometimes more contemporary editions of an older Hebrew work will include footnotes explaining what the older usage of the Hebrew means in the contemporary.
Right. So then, yeah,
really
it's like translating between different eras is that equivalent to translating between different languages.
It can be, yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. But yeah, what you say about sort of translating slang and colloquialisms also kind of requires, you know, some familiarity with how Hebrew is being used today. And I know, you know, for instance, one of the authors that you've translated, Maya Arad, is a Hebrew writer who's lived most of her adult life in the United States. And she's described her position vis-a-vis Israel as being in Israel, but not quite. And I was thinking about how until this pandemic, really, you've visited Israel pretty regularly, but you've lived for many years now in the United States. And so I'm interested, is distance helpful for a translator and for you as a translator? And if so, in what ways can distance be productive? And when does sort of proximity to Israeli culture actually prove necessary to some degree?
Yeah, I mean, it struck me not too long ago that I've spent more of my life in English-speaking countries than in Israel, even though I consider my Israeliness like a pretty major part of my identity. I think for a translator, you know, the kind of conventional wisdom is that the language you're translating into is the more important. That's the one you need to have the better facility in. And I think that's true. And that being the case, it is more important for me to be immersed in English. Because I'm writing in English. And I have seen cases of translators who are really good, but who've been living in Israel for the past 40, 50 years, and their English gets a bit stale. So they may have a better command than I do of colloquial, you know, contemporary Hebrew, but coming into English, there ends up being something just a bit off about it because they haven't lived in an English-speaking country for most of their life. So, you know, I guess the ideal would be to have both. And these days you kind of can, even if you're not geographically moving back and forth. It's just so much easier to have access. You know, I can be sitting here in Denver and listening to Israeli radio, and, you know, I read the Hebrew papers every day. And those things do help. But I will say that every time I go back, which is pre-pandemic, once or twice a year, I always encounter new slang, new phrases, because I think, as we all know, you know, Hebrew just grows and moves and evolves so quickly that it's hard to keep up if you're not really, you know, like out there in the streets hearing people talk. So it's definitely easier to keep up now than it used to be, but I still run into things when I'm translating where I have to ask someone, preferably someone younger than me, you know, what does this mean? How is it used? And, you know, you mentioned Maya Arad, and it's astounding to me that she has the command that she does of not just, you know, linguistically, but the tone and the kind of social mannerisms that are just very, very typical of contemporary Israelis. And she has not lived there for, you know, most of her adult life. But there, at least to my ears, there's never anything off about her tone when she has Israeli characters speaking. So it is possible, but I think you do have to kind of put a conscious effort into maintaining that.
Right. And you mentioned how, in some ways, the internet has facilitated these kind of abilities to kind of encounter Israeli culture through radio, music. Israeli TV is really having its moment. And I actually wanted to ask you about this a little bit because it feels like, you know, thanks to Netflix and also HBO on demand, we have shows like Shtizel and Fauda on our screens and adaptations of Israeli shows. And I'm sort of curious if you've noticed this fueling a certain demand for certain kind of Israeli narratives. I'm not asking so much about what's being published in Israel, but that as a translator, are you seeing projects coming through the pipeline that maybe are considering translation to the screen, which I think is a relatively new thing?
Yeah, I've seen an influence of that in as much as there are writers who, you know, just coming out of the gate with a new book, the first thing they're saying is, I think this could make a good TV show. Mm. And in many cases, I agree, it could. And there are books which, you know, I've either translated or have done a sample for them and kind of, you know, involved in some effort to get it published, where the writer has been able to, you know, usually through connections that they already have, get interest from American TV or film producers, which then will make them more appealing to a publisher. So, you know, I think it used to be the other way around, right? You would have to get the book published first, and then maybe someone would come across it at a book fair or something and pick it up for TV. And it's going the other way around now, at least in some cases that I'm familiar with. And often it won't actually, I mean, it may be too soon to say this, but right now I have a couple cases I can think of where I know that the book the rights have been sold to TV producers, and there's probably going to be something made. And I'm not sure if the book will ever come out in English, even though there's a whole translation. It might just be, you know, straight to Netflix and just skip the whole literary phase of that creature. It's just, which is kind of strange, I think. But that's the reality that we're living in, that I think in many cases, television has become so good, with many exceptions, of course, but you know, there is really good high quality TV, and maybe that's what people want. And if there's a good story to be told, it can be told on TV, and just not bother with the book.
Right. And yeah, and that as a translator, you're playing some part in sort of in that process, except we may not actually see your actual labor as a book, right? And finally, because I want to leave time for the Q&A, and I can see we have some questions coming in. Just a brief thing, if you could be in charge of everything, what are some things you would like to see translated and why?
Wow. I mean, you know, it's hard for me to say. I can tell you like specific individual works that I think are brilliant and should be out in English. I don't necessarily have types or even genres of things that I think should be out more. I mean, although I think all things considered, I would say I'd be happy if there were more women translated, because I think there are a lot of Israeli women writers who are doing really interesting things. And this ties back to what we were talking about what people think Israeli literature is or should be. And I think that although this is like a huge generalization, there is something about a lot of women's writing, at least now in Israel, that is quote unquote more domestic, they're more personal family stories that for that reason are universal, but I think they make them less appealing outside of Israel, because again, people say, well, why would I read this that happens to take place in Israel when I can read, you know, an American writer? And I think that's a shame because there is a lot of good writing. Specific works, you know, you mentioned before that the National Endowment for the Arts, that I have a fellowship to translate Leah Ainey, who is a really prolific and very, very highly regarded writer in Israel, not commercial, particularly because her writing is very dense, very demanding. But I think she's a brilliant writer, and this book that I'm going to be translating, it's called Rose of Lebanon, and it's really, you know, I know this is going to sound like hyperbole, but I think it is a contender for the great Israeli novel. It's just has an amazing combination of being like intensely personal and intimate, but at the same time telling a much larger story of Israel and what Israeli society is and was. So that's a book that I really hope can find a publisher. That's going to be an uphill battle. And then the book I'm translating now, which you know, doesn't really check any of the boxes that publishers are looking for now, because the author is a, you know, Jewish Ashkenazi straight male. So nothing about that is what people think should be coming out, but it's just a brilliant book. His name is Uri Katz, and the book is called Ha'ish Shenitka Lo Hapartzuf Hazoef. I don't have an English title yet, but something like The Man Who Got Stuck with a Sullen Face. That's what I'm going with now. And it's just so original and so imaginative, unlike anything I've read in English or Hebrew for the past few years. So, you know, that's a book that I think could just be a brilliant book in whatever language it's translated to. And the Israeliness of it is kind of accidental.
Well, thank you so much. The conversation is going to continue, but not with me, now with the attendees, some of whom have submitted questions. But before I turn things over to Maya, who will be moderating, I want to say a special thank you to Kelsey Keeves for her help setting up this webinar, and also to the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies for its support. So thank you so much, Jessica. And now we're going to turn things over to Maya.
Thank you both for this really fascinating conversation, and a lot of the issues you two raised will come up also in the Q&A. And I'm also inviting everybody who's attending to post more questions if you have them. I'll be drawing from questions that were submitted in advance, as well as the ones you put up in the Q&A. And yeah, and to introduce myself, I'm Maya Barzilai. This year, I'm the co-head fellow with Adriana of the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies. And on normal days, I would be teaching in the Judaic Studies Center and in the Middle East Studies program. So I'll begin with a question that dovetails nicely with what you've just been talking about, and which is the selection of what gets translated. But this question also is a broader question about the field of translation from Hebrew into English, not only specifically about your own choices, Jessica. And Avery Weinman asks, you mentioned that the selection of whose work gets translated and published as one of the main ways that the act of translating is political. How do you think this relates to Mizrahi literature in Israel, and how it is or is not easily accessible to an English-speaking audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is changing, but still to a great degree, the American, or I should say, Jewish American, or perception of Israeli literature, of Israel in general, is through the lens of Ashkenazi culture, right? So, I mean, there used to be this joke about when I was growing up in Israel, like in the 80s, American Jews would come to Israel and they'd be like, where are the bagels and lox, right? Because we didn't have bagels in Israel until, you know, well into the 80s. Because that's Jewish American, which is mostly Ashkenazi. So there are many ways in which I think Mizrahi culture is just excluded from the perception of what it is to be Israeli. And that is reflected in the literature. I don't, you know, I haven't done any kind of a statistical study of this, but I would bet that overwhelmingly books that are translated, maybe up until just a few years ago, have been by Ashkenazi writers. I don't know that there is any kind of conscious effort to exclude. In fact, I really don't think there is, at least in terms of American or British publishing. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, you look at someone like Ronit Matalon, who even in Israel, although she was critically acclaimed, she's not a commercially successful author in particular. And I think her Mizrachiyut is not the reason for that, but her Mizrachiyut is the basis for a sensibility that she has in her writing and a sense of being marginalized and being something of an outsider looking in that does contribute to that. So it's maybe, you know, not the narrative that Israelis are used to reading and necessarily want to read. And that's more acute when you go outside of Israel. Again, you know, these marginalized voices who may be critical are not what most English readers want to see in a book about Israel. But I do think that's changing a bit. And I think the distinction between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi is, I don't want to say it's not, of course it's still there, but I think it is getting less acute, kind of as the generations progress. So hopefully there will be more of those voices in English.
One of the fellows at our institute mentioned in our discussion yesterday the Italian translation of the same Ronit Matalon novella and how it folklorizes the text a little bit. So I imagine that would be also a pitfall that you have to contend with. And I'm wondering, to follow up on that question about your translation of Dorit Rabinyan as another example, if you wanted to say anything about that project, and then we'll go to another question from the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, that was a book that did come out with a major press in the States, and I think there was some hope that it would be a commercial success. And, you know, I mean, Dorit Rabinyan is, you know, it's her identity, I think, is a little complicated. She is a Mizrahi writer. That's not anything she's ever hidden, but I don't think it's a major aspect of her identity as a writer. And, you know, the main issue at the forefront of that book, All the Rivers, was the fact that she's Jewish, and, you know, the main character, but it is a heavily autobiographical book, is having an affair with a Palestinian in New York. And so it was something that really engaged more with this idea of, is there a place outside of Israel in which a Jewish Israeli and a Palestinian can come together in a way that they would not be able to, in many cases would not be able to physically, but certainly psychologically would not be able to in Israel. And I think her Mizrachiyut, or I should say the protagonist Mizrachiyut, was probably not something that came through very strongly in English, because the clues, you know, the things that an Israeli reader would pick up on in the original were pretty subtle. They were not in the foreground, and so it was hard to make that something foregrounded in English. And I didn't think it was really the most important part of it anyway.
Thank you. So two people, both in the questions in advance and right now, have a similar question, so I'm going to join it together. Ehud Har-Even wants to know, what are the unique cultural-related idioms that you found the most challenging to translate to English for the American reader? And you talked about a few of those already, but maybe you have a few choice examples from your recent translations. And similarly, Yaakov Hershkovitz wants to know, can you think of an example of a word or phrase that you found especially challenging to translate, or perhaps even untranslatable? And you've talked about that also a little bit, but both of them really want you to pick an idiom, a specific idiom or specific term that you have found difficult.
Yeah, I mean, there are many in every book. That's why translation is difficult, is exactly those things. I mean, there's something in this Ronit Matalon book, what I'll mention again, when the bride closed the door. It's in the passage that some of you have been reading at Michigan. And it's just a little tiny detail in the description of the apartment that they're in, which is, the book mentions that hanging on the wall is a clock that was a gift from Cool. I think in English, like, it's Cool Industries. Yeah, so it's a Konzertenkohl in Hebrew. Now, just those couple of words mean so much more in Hebrew or in an Israeli context than I could possibly get across in English. So Cool was, you know, this conglomerate of industries that was founded by, basically it was an outlet of the workers' union. Something started in the 40s. So if you're in someone's apartment and there's a clock on the wall that, you know, has the logo of Cool, and it was obviously an employee's gift, you know that this is a working class family. You know that this is, you know, someone who's kind of on the lower rung probably of working class. This was like probably their gift for, you know, Rosh Hashanah or something. And it says it's old, so this was many years ago. So there's just a lot of cultural and almost political connotations to that very innocuous seeming clock on the wall. And I couldn't get across all of this in English. As I say, the only way to have done that would have been the footnote, which I don't do. So that's something that, you know, to be honest, is there isn't really a good way to get all of that across. So some people, I would imagine that most readers just see that name, and if it doesn't mean anything to them, they just keep reading, and they'll never know the significance. Some may be curious and may look it up and figure out what it is. Another example from David Grossman's book, A Horse Walks into a Bar, is in the very first line of the book, where the main character, who's a stand-up comedian, he comes out onto the stage and he says, "Erev Tov Keisaria." Now, this is a line that to Israelis, well, it has two layers of meaning. One, it's kind of a reference to, so Caesarea is an extremely wealthy town on the coast of Israel. In this context, it has kind of two meanings. One is that there's a very large concert arena, an amphitheater there, where, you know, the biggest stars of Israeli pop and rock have performed, and it's kind of a big deal to get there. And, you know, Shlomo Artzi, who's one of the kind of most, you know, mainstream Israeli pop stars, performed there and is kind of famous for using that line, Erev Tov Keisaria, good evening, Caesarea. And so when this stand-up comic in this divey little bar uses that line, the irony is immediately there for Israelis. Also, Caesarea is just, you know, it's a very wealthy, upscale town. I mean, Bibi has a house there, so that tells you all you need to know. And in reality, where he is, you know, in this kind of, not, you know, yeah, he's in a divey bar in a small town that is more of a kind of a working class town. It's kind of the antithesis of Caesarea, which you find out in the next line. So again, to get all of that across in English was basically impossible. But what I was able to come up with in the end is kind of just adding one tiny little descriptive adjective, which I believe what he says in English is, "Good evening to the majestic city of Caesarea." So the idea is to just give readers who know nothing of this place just a little hint to, you know, the glory of where he thinks he is, and then the reality of where he admits that he actually is, which is in Netanya, which is, you know, as I said, kind of the opposite of Caesarea. But those are things that, as I was saying before, there's no real rule as to how to do it. It depends on the context. But when you're talking about a key sentence in the very first line of a book, you can't just omit it. There has to be a solution there.
Well, thank you. You might find the next question to be like diametrically opposed to what you just answered, but I think there's actually a relationship between the two types of question. And two people asked also another question in a similar vein, so I'll join them. It's Alex Moshkin and Shachar Pinsker both want to know, do you think some Israeli writers write for translation? Or in the words of Rebecca Walkovitz, Some works have been written for translation from the start. They're kind of born in translation. So do Israeli writers do that? They write for a world audience, an international audience, especially of English readers. They want their books to be internationally consumed. And how does that affect then your own work and how you translate?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this claim. I don't believe, well, let me say this. I do think there are a lot of Israeli writers who very much want to be translated into many languages, but particularly into English, because it is a really big market, and I think it's considered kind of a sign of having made it, right, if you get published in English. And I think many of these writers, you know, are quite open about that aspiration. But I don't believe that it affects their writing. I really don't. At least the writers that I've come across, and I'm talking about, you know, literary writers. There are cases of people who write a book and don't even bother to publish it in Hebrew and email me saying, can you translate this book? I know it's going to do really well in English. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about published writers in Israel who have serious literary ambition in Israel. In my experience, they do not write for translation. I don't really see how they could. And I can tell you that if that were true, then my job would be a lot easier, because I wouldn't keep running across things that are, you know, extremely particular to Israeli culture or to the Hebrew language that are very difficult to translate. You know, in commercial translation, there's kind of a whole kind of movement to explain to technical writers or copywriters how to write in a way that makes it easier to translate things, and to avoid very specific colloquialisms, to avoid local references, right, so that things can carry across to different languages easier. No one does that in literature. I don't buy it. I do think that there are books and there are styles that lend themselves more easily to kind of a universal sensibility. I mean, I know someone like Nir Baram, for example, who I've translated and I think is a fantastic writer. He has one book in particular that most of it doesn't take place in Israel, and the characters are not even Israeli. And I know he's someone who's been accused, quote unquote, accused of, you know, writing for translation, writing for the world. But at the same time, you know, Hebrew is it's his language. He couldn't be writing in any other language. And so by definition, he is a very Israeli writer. And at the same time, he's engaged in themes and topics that preoccupy readers all over the world, or people all over the world. And that's just what he's interested in exploring in his writing. So I don't think it's a fair accusation. And in my opinion, it's not. I haven't seen it borne out to be true.
Mm-hmm. So I have one more question in the queue here that pertains to, again, to another aspect of your work, which is kind of the processes of editing that might go into the translation. So Liz Brader wants to know, or comments that she's noticed that you've omitted certain passages of Grossman's writing in the English version. Similarly, Nicholas Lang tightened up some of Oz's work in English. Does a translator also have a role as an editor? If so, why? And how are these decisions made? Are they made by the translator in collaboration with the author, maybe by the editors and publishers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the specific circumstance. So for example, Nicholas Matalon worked very, very closely with Amos Oz on every book that he translated. And I know that they had a lot of correspondence and discussion, you know, right throughout the process of translating. So I'm sure that anything that was omitted in Nicholas's translations was done entirely, you know, with Amos's knowledge and approval. In my case, also, I would never omit something without consulting with the author. And mostly when there have been omissions, it's been done, I think I mentioned before that sometimes there is kind of a consensus that a book is too long for the English market. And by consensus, I mean it's an agreement between the editor, and the author and myself. Obviously, no author is enthusiastic about having their work cut, but I've never really come across a case where there's been really strong resistance. And I think if there had been, then we would have respected the author's wishes, because he or she has to have the final say. And you know, Israeli writers are almost always shocked by the extent of editing their work goes through in English. The editing culture in Israeli publishing just is very different. The editing is not as rigorous. In every book I translate, I come across things that, in my opinion, should have been edited out, or just edited, period. And I'm talking even on the level of, you know, inconsistencies and just continuity errors that should have been caught and were not. Often, you know, it's a question of budget and just not having the resources to do it. So then it gets to a publishing house in English, and the editor, you know, will not let these things pass. And most writers are grateful for it. And often I've been told that people feel that their work in English is, you know, closer to what it really should have been in the original. In the case of Grossman, the only book where we've really done substantial cuts was in To the End of the Land, which was translated from Misha Barachad Mitzorah, which is, again, it was a very, very long book. And the editor in particular felt that the first section of the book, which is known as the prologue, and is written in quite confusing, disorienting kind of language, he felt that it was going to be a really hard sell for people to kind of wade through, you know, 50 or 60 pages of this until they get to kind of the main narrative. And so we did all agree that we would cut. And that's the only book that I've done where there have been really significant cuts. And it was all done with Grossman's approval. Painful, but he did approve.
I think we actually just got in another question. We have 3 more minutes, so I will include it, and I'm happy to. And then we will end on time. So this is by Naama Rokem. So early on you talked about David Grossman's notion that there is another version of your life that you might have lived, another latent possibility. And that could also be an interesting way to think about translation, that is another version of the novel in a different language. So the translation is realizing this latent possibility, the latent possibility that fiction gives us. Does this resonate for you in terms of your craft as a translator?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, most translators have kind of if not purely bilingual, then at least some kind of bicultural, you know, the people who've moved around, lived in different countries and different cultures, and I certainly have. And I've come to realize over time that that's where my attraction to translation comes from. It's a way for me to play with this idea of who might I have been if my biography had been different, right? If I hadn't been moved from one country to another at the age of 7 and then moved again in my 20s, you know, and playing with these 2 languages, which, you know, are more than just languages, because a language has, you know, so much weight behind it. It is a way to, I think, to say, yeah, what would this work have been if it were written by an English-speaking writer, which in many ways is an kind of artificial and unanswerable question, but it is a question that's really interesting to think about, I think. And I like Naama's way of putting it, as the translation being a different version that might have existed if the kind of time and place, circumstances of the writer had been different.
Well, thank you so much for, you know, taking on all of the lot of heavy and interesting, important questions about translation, for being an advocate for translation of Hebrew works into English, and for giving us your time today. Thank you also really to Adriana Jacobs for doing the first section of the discussion section, and to Kelsey for all her technical support, and to all of you for participating today. And we hope to see you in future events we have every month. We have such a public occasion to meet a translator or a scholar of translation studies. So we hope to see you again. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.